Sounds made up from some scary story. No idea why they call it that, but it's quite fitting. There was a campsite that is pretty frequently used about half a mile from the portage. We just called the campsite Headman's. Steven and his trip left Shoal Lake aiming to get through Headman's Portage and stay at the campsite right after it. It's a little long, but a nice highway of portage without too many ups and downs. I believe the Canadian Park Service even clears out this portage, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in the Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is just surreal and beautiful. It's through a little stream, with 10 to 15 foot cliffs on both sides covered in moss and beautiful cedars. Steven and his trip got to Headman's campsite, and later on, just before they were going to bed, they discovered they left their sleeping bag at the end of the portage. It was around 9, so it was getting pretty dark by this point. Steven and a camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps quickly to retrieve the pack. The paddle took them about a half hour, and at this point you could really only see what your headlamp was shining on. They grabbed the bag and started to head back. Shortly after leaving, Steven started to hear loud splashes and things falling from the water behind them. He dismissed it at first because beavers are pretty common in this area, and when they slap their tails it sounds pretty identical to a huge rock being chucked into the water. But the splashes kept going, and were right on his back as they kept paddling. Steven looked behind him to see a huge rock around the size of a baseball come flying at him and land into the water at his side. They began to paddle like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was chucking these giant, super heavy rocks at them. Steven looked back between the paddles, and on one of the cliffs about 15 feet up, he saw two distinct red glowing eyes on top of it. The rocks stopped and they made it back okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely without any other occurrences. But I never feel great about going through Headman's Portage, and triple check that I don't have any bags there when I do. This story takes place about 2 years ago. My aunt, married into the family, has cousins, not related to me, who live on a farm in LaPointe, Utah, on a reservation, and thought it would be fun to have all us other cousins go stay with her for a few days and see the Dinosaur National Monument. My aunt's grandmother had recently passed away, and her house was basically empty, so we went to stay there. It was a pretty old house, to say the least. It was made out of painted white cedar blocks and was pretty run down, but we were only staying there a few days, so we didn't care how luxurious it was. The front door led into a small kitchen, and off the kitchen to the right was a small room with a TV, 2 couches, and a chair. Off of that room was a larger living area with 2 more pull-out couches and a door leading to the side of the house. Off the living room was a hall that led into 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. It was a pretty small house considering we had around 18 people staying there. Along with the old and empty house we were staying in, there were 2 other houses on the property belonging to my aunts, cousins, and their families. These were the only houses for about 2 miles. There were 12 kids in total, ranging from 3 to 16, me being the oldest, as well as the 2 other kids who lived in the other houses who wanted to come stay with us. We all slept on the pull-out couches and the floor. Other than the parents, there were 2 other people who were staying there. They were soon to be married, so they were staying there for a few days before the wedding. It was a whole big mess of people, but bear with me. They didn't want to sleep in the same house because they weren't married, and religion and all this crap. So the guy, we'll call him B, was sleeping in the small camper outside while his fiancée slept in one of the bedrooms. Now we can actually get to the creepy stuff. On the first night we were there, me and one of my cousins were on the pull-out couch in the first little room, while all the other kids were either on the other couches or on the floor, in either our room or the other. It was about midnight. Most of the kids were already asleep. We were watching Disney movies and dozing off when we started to hear strange noises outside toward the field. It sounded like low growling and panting, but not entirely like it was coming from an animal. There was just this weird human-like sound to it. I assumed it was some sort of stray animal and got up to see when one of the other kids who lived next door, we'll call him L, jumped up and told me just to ignore it and go to sleep. I was really confused and the noises were still happening, but the terrified look on his face told me I should listen. The creature would pace around the house and stop at the door by the kitchen for a few minutes before continuing to circle the house. Neither of us got any sleep that night. The next night was basically the same setup. Kids sleeping everywhere, movies playing, a few people still dozing off. I was exhausted from the night before and managed to fall asleep when I was woken up by one of the youngest kids quietly crying and crawling into bed with me. We'll call him A. I asked him what was the matter, and he said he was scared by the big dog outside the window. I turned to L and asked if they had a dog. He looked completely scared out of his mind and said no, and told me to ignore it once again. I stayed up for a while after that, watching movies with A, when he asked me to walk with him to the bathroom. A little bit of explanation before I continue. This house was shaped like a short L, the bottom part being the kitchen and the 2 living rooms, and where it turns was the hallway with the bedrooms and the bathroom. The bathroom was right at the beginning of the hall. There was a small window to where you could see the wall, where the first living room was, straight ahead, along with a window that you could see through into the living room, where we were sleeping, and then the rest of the house to the left. Anyways, I was walking A to the bathroom and switch on the light when I see it. An extremely tall, dog-like creature standing on its hind legs facing the window looking into the living room. Its fur was matted and its eyes seemed to be almost glowing orangish red. Its hands looked human-like, but with dark fur and long claws. I screamed and the creature ran back around the side of the house on its hind legs. I picked up A and carried him back to the living room to quickly find L closing the curtains. "What was that?" I whispered to L. "I don't know." "If you ignore it, it'll go away," he whispered back. "You've seen it before?" "Only a couple times, but not recently." Our talking woke up L's younger sister, and surprisingly, nobody else. I'm guessing she knew what was going on because she seemed just as scared as we were. I sat A down on the bed and turned the TV up louder, drowning out the sounds of the creature was making outside, and hoping to calm A down a bit and take our minds off whatever the hell we just saw. The noises circling the house continued for about another half hour, when they stopped at the back door in the other room. I peered my head around the corner to face the door. The door handle on the first door started to move back and forth. You could see the silhouette of something huge behind it. I rushed over to shut and lock the other door, trying not to wake anyone else. Just as I did, B, guy sleeping in the camper outside, also L's uncle, burst through the kitchen door, slamming it behind him. L asked B what was going on, but he didn't want to say another word and rushed down the hall and into the bedroom with his fiancée. He came out holding a shotgun and pulled a chair into the corner of the living room, giving him a view of both the kitchen and the back door. He gave us a look of both terror and anger. He told us to go back to sleep. We didn't. He sat there all night until the noises stopped around sunrise, then went back outside into the camper without saying a word. I'm surprised no one else woke up, and no one else knows what happened that night. The next morning, there were huge paw prints around the house, and B was discussing something with L's dad, who lived in one of the other houses. They both looked concerned and scared. It was very unsettling. We left later that day for reasons I can't remember, but I'm glad we did. I didn't want to spend another night in that house, and I'm pretty sure that what we saw that night was a skinwalker. This story belongs to a friend of mine. He told me this once and I simply have to tell it. My friend is of Native American heritage, a tribe who settled the North Pacific West Coast. He is quite the character. For one, he is a whopping 6'10", and he has the blackest eyes you could imagine. He always has this frowning face going on, which makes him seem even more intimidating. He is everything but a bad guy. In fact, he is the most gentle of giants. He was working at a gas station up north back in 1992, and he pretty much always worked the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Business wasn't exactly booming at nights, so he was usually watching TV or reading magazines between customers, and there were a few. The area he lived and worked in was deeply associated with all things Native American. There was a potent sense of pride in the surrounding communities, but also a very distinct presence of superstition and old traditions. My friend was no exception. He was a firm believer of the ways of old. This made his encounter even more terrifying. One night, he was sitting as usual, watching TV when a customer entered the gas station. The customer paid for his gas, a pack of smokes, and some soda and returned to his car. Nothing unusual. But my friend looked out the window toward the customer's car, and he spotted what looked like a huge dog sitting by the edge of the woods. Now, the window was located on the side of the building, some distance from the door, overlooking the pumps and the roof covering it. On the sides of the roof are pretty strong lights, which shine into the gas station. This gives the gas station not only an eerie lighting with the blinds casting long, striped shadows, but also blinds the teller to an extent. As he peered through the window trying to focus on the dog, it was gone. He didn't think much of it. Even if it was a wolf, He was inside, and wolves don't tend to rob gas stations at night. Wolves were common here, but this wolf was huge. He brushed it off and returned to his mindless watching of TV. A couple of hours go by and not a single customer has entered since the last one. He was just about to refill some condiments when he heard a large thud coming from the back. It wasn't inside, he could hear that, but it came from the back. And behind the building they kept the garbage. The gas station had been visited before by the scavenging homeless, but my friend didn't really care. It wasn't his garbage, and it was just garbage. Let them take it. But it kept getting louder. He decided to grab a flashlight and a gun from the office and circle around back to tell whoever ventured there to leave. His presence alone would have scared off anyone, but he wanted to feel safe just in case. He exited through the sliding doors, walking past the window he was just sitting by. As he turned the corner, he shines a light towards the dumpsters. As the cone of light hits the dumpsters, my friend instantly drops the flashlight and the gun. It's the huge dog he saw before, scouring through the garbage. It wasn't a dog, though. It clearly stood on its hind legs, reaching the same height as him. It couldn't be a bear, as it was too gaunt. The creature's eyes had been glowing in the light of the flashlight, making it even more terrifying. He ran inside the gas station and wasn't followed. He locked the door, stayed inside the whole night, and quit the next day. My friend is convinced that he saw a skinwalker, a shape-shifting shaman of sorts, which are a common occurrence in the Native American lore and culture. It's just a really creepy story. I'm not sure what to think of what happened. I may just be overthinking things, or my sister may have just been joking with me. I figured I would share my small story here, in case anyone had any insight on what happened. However, I don't quite believe anything is monstrous, as I suspect to be at fault. I probably just misheard. For perspective, I will tell you that I live out of the southern part of British Columbia, Canada. I live a good hour and a half away from the nearest town by car, and my home is completely surrounded by forest with a few distant neighbors. It is not uncommon for us to see and hear coyotes, wolves, bears, and cougars, so we have a large dog for protection. However, the latest dog passed on, so our new protector is just a puppy and she's not very brave just yet. And I don't think she could have helped the situation if she wanted to. It happened the summer after my graduation. I got a call from one of my neighbors asking if I could tend to her garden while her and her husband went on a fishing trip. I took the walk down the hill with my dog through the brush so that she could lay out the details of specific care her plants would need. My family has known this woman since we moved into our home 20 years ago, and as children we would all go down and visit her, make her cards and chat, and she would allow us to play in her swimming pool in the summer. I trust her completely and have house sat for her before, so it was no odd request for my sister and I to go help out. The garden was new and absolutely beautiful. I have a garden of my own, but it was nothing compared to hers, which was gated and was in pristine condition. The mosquitoes were horrid, so she made her instructions short and I retreated back up the hill to inform my little sister of our assignment. The first day was terribly hot. My sister and I attempted to get up early to evade the heat and bloodsuckers, but in the end they were all sitting in the shade waiting for us to arrive. It took a full hour and a half to completely soak the entire garden, and by then we were sweating, bloody, itchy and irritable from all of our newfound bite marks. We were supposed to water the garden every morning so that the sun wouldn't dry up the water throughout the day. So I got up early to wake my sister, who after yesterday's assignment refused to go down with me, protesting that she wanted to sleep in and to leave her alone. Not wanting to be held responsible for the demise of my neighbor's veggies, I reluctantly trotted down the path to my neighbor's. Both my dogs were off on some squirrel-infested adventure, so my trek was made alone. Only a few birds that morning until I made it farther down, and the closer I got, the quieter it became. My attention, however, was on the sun, and I wanted to finish my task ASAP. When I was almost done, I took a stretch and went to turn off the hose, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Across the field, from the garden, I thought I heard a person, which would have been very odd, so I stood still to listen. What I heard was my sister calling my name in a shrill voice. My sister and I would often call each other in strange, exaggerated screeches and voices in just that particular way. I knew for a fact that my sister is far too lazy to hike all the way down and sneak through the brush across the field just to yell at me. I listened again but heard nothing. Finishing up, I assumed I had just misheard, believing it to have been a bird or something, though the odd happening struck in my mind. Later on, I referred the account to my sister, who laughed and joked with me that this must have been the creature her friend told her about. The creature she was referring to was called Wendigo or Skinwalker. I honestly don't know the difference between the two. I don't know what these creatures are or if they actually exist, but if they were to, they're supposed to live in this kind of area. I put it out of my mind anyway, not believing in such things. The next day, I was with my sister tending the garden, and my dog came down to see us. I was shocked to see her paw was all bloody, thinking that she had cut herself on a piece of sheet metal. I ran with her back up to the house to see if I could clean and fix it. My sister didn't want to come up with me, so she stayed in the garden to finish up watering her part. It turned out the blood on my dog's paw was not her own, and that she had simply caught an unfortunate pack rat, whom she delightedly tore to pieces. When I came back, my sister wasn't in the garden. Confused, I began to walk to my neighbor's house when she came outside to meet me. She told me she had heard her name being called from across the field in my voice, in the same way I heard mine. She was visibly spooked and insisted we go back up to our house and leave the garden for tomorrow. I refused and told her she could go up without me if she wanted, but I had to finish the garden. I suspected she was only kidding with me, and I was waiting for her to give up right away, like she normally would. Instead, she stayed with me, holding her arms, and refused to walk home alone. Once we finished, we both came back together for the next 3 mornings to water the garden, and no other occurrences happened. To this day, my sister claims she wasn't lying. I'm not sure if these creatures are supposed to be smart enough or talented enough to pull off stunts so specific. We have lived in the same house in the middle of the woods for our whole lives, and we can be loud and silly without fear of annoying anyone. But if someone or something had been close enough to listen, they definitely had plenty of time to do so. Also, how these occurrences only happened when we were alone gives me goosebumps. If you have any answers for me, I would appreciate any info you have. I won't reveal who I am or much about where I live, and to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened, but I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning, this is a very long read and some of the content below is very disturbing, but I can't hold back, so here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of the summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people consider to be sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in church, you don't let the American flag touch the ground, you don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway, and since no one else was going, he managed to get me to go with him. That's one of my other hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he'd been there before, though only once. His ploy had been to get me to come with him, so he could show me. He admitted this in the casual way that friends admit being jerks to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from the town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountains, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to go to the bathroom and I stepped off the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past the shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me and I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other side, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget. Though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, brush, but suddenly, It all stopped within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks. There was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them. Symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around, as if they actually had been in a perfect brick wall, and something shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame old number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead though, we kept going. After all, the day was only half over. While the forest itself was cool, at least Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There was no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat, it was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end. There was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started to get really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we would have to walk these same 3 boring hours back. We took our time eating our lunch. As we did, I swear I could hear noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually though, I noticed it was making far too much noise, and it was doing so far too frequently. Mark told me to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned around and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as I was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how the deer was annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time it was funny. "Hey Buck, yeah, you, leave us alone." He walked off the road and disappeared down the ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark?" I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark." I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in my mind. I wouldn't go far. I knew, because he was smart enough to not go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there was no signs of struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and all over the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things too in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. "Mark," I called out, ferociously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward, along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine, with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it would hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again, "Mark." I heard something, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the brush and revealed itself. It was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every single day for the past few months trying to tell myself it wasn't real. At first, I saw a head of a buck, but it came forward and I realized that it was at least 7 feet above the ground. I was staring at a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not like the horns of an average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized, a mess of sharp points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked. I remember both of its arms and legs. They started human, but near the bottom they distorted and became animalistic. At the end of its legs were powerful hooves. At the end of its arms were hands and very long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws was Mark's body being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang, suddenly. It's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar. Something that sounded like a grizzly bear and a buck shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all of my life, but it was gaining on me, and as I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I got in front of it. Somehow, I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore. But I didn't care. I kept running. I have never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon. I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up the trail. At the point where it went up between the two mountains, and was visible from the road, I would regret it. Standing there at the beginning of the trail was the Skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily dead to one side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail and didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition and floored the car and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me. I thought I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in my dreams, nightmares. That creature, the Skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long. I'm not being followed by anything other than my memories of that moment. That moment that felt like an eternity to me was clearly only a few seconds, but they were the most haunting seconds of my life. For a bit of context, I'm a Canadian university student currently living in central Quebec. Not like Montreal or anything, but a very small town bordering a very small city in the middle of nowhere. The landscapes are sort of an emerald dream, with titanic mountains jutting out aggressively, all of which blanketed in a dense forest. I love my town. Everything's within walking distance. Friends, the bar, the lake. It's all great and nearby. So we often hit the town together. No need to drive anywhere or anything. Last night, we decided to have a little bonfire on this little ridge off the side of the lake, which doesn't really provide too much surface area for a bonfire. For this reason, the 10 of us were huddled around a dimly lit campfire instead. Guitar is being played, fine alcohol is being drank, and good times are being had by all. As the night draws on, I've charged myself with keeping the bulk of the fire going. Nobody else is too apt at any sort of camping, or otherwise outdoorsy activities in my group. Up to this point, all was very normal, other than my close friends acting a little off. After our first few, he had ran out and left by himself to go get more. The ridge was out of sight of the road due to the dense forest paths that we used to get to and from it, so he goes and cuts through it alone. When he gets back, he's acting like he had 100 beers. Looked like he wasn't used to his legs. Strangely enough, he had a full case of beer with him, so I assumed he hadn't drank any more. He also wasn't gone for very long at all. Honestly, we drank together often, me and him. I know what he's like drunk, and this was especially unusual. So he's trying to talk to the people, but he just can't say real words. It's as if he was trying to perform all of the accents of normal English speech, but didn't actually understand the words or syntax. Kind of like one of those videos that are meant to show what English might sound like to non-English speakers. As I mentioned before, the fire wasn't providing much in terms of light. So when we'd head off to go grab some firewood, I'd usually jerry-rig my cell phone flashlight to my belt to keep the area in front of me well lit. We do this a few times, and some of the others begin to lose motivation to collect wood, so I take matters into my own hands for the last run of the evening. This brush was completely uncultivated, super thick, very dark. The only discernible paths that were about shoulder width were obstructed by an oddly fallen tree here and there. So I'm yanking at trees, trying to feel for anything dry. Even my phone light was falling behind waist-level foliage. I didn't really have too much lighting. Once I got a handful or so, I figured it'd be good enough for the last burn, so I get the idea to head back. But just as I get this thought, my phone falls straight onto the ground. So of course, it had to land face down, blocking the flash, preventing me from finding the right way. Regardless, I didn't look forward immediately. For some reason, I decided to let the darkness sink in. I had never been in such a dark environment that I was unable to see my hand in front of my face. Even the brightest moonbeams couldn't breach the canopy above. However, as I focus on my surroundings, I quickly realized I was referencing my frame using a subtle glow. It was yellowish but twisted into a green color the more I concentrated. I was immediately very startled by its lack of movement, yet curious. I hesitantly paced inward, carelessly leaving my phone on the ground. The glow split distinctly into two yellow-green bulbs that were locked onto each other. They're my eyes. My vision is really bad, especially with lighting, so from a distance my eyes will merge the source of light together. For instance, I can't see stars. This caused my curiosity to go nuts. What kind of fat raccoon is trying to stalk me through these bushes? Something was hitting me though. I was terrified. I bore a fear so intense that my stomach began to churn. My curiosity has always outweighed my fears, and this situation was no different. I began to know what it was. It began to know me. There was this very strange bond in that moment that chilled me to the core. I felt a connection to this living thing, but its eyes were pumping fear into my body. The worst mistake I'd ever make is to follow. Nervously, I yelled loud enough to attempt to startle whatever it may have been in this chilling stare down against me at only about a 7 or 8 foot distance. Its absolutely motionless reaction to my help began to chip away at my sanity. Was I staring at two elaborately placed lights in the middle of the woods? No, it couldn't be. They had eyes, and this battle cry didn't even make him flinch. Because of that, part of me rationalized that it could not possibly be any animal. It's probably some kind of prank, or a marker for some type of ecology job. So I pressed towards it again, walking as if I knew for sure that this was all to be logically explained. As I closed the gap, my vision began to home in on these lights. Plainly defined ovals, resplendent with the brightest darkness I'd ever felt. When they were legitimately just out of my range of clear vision, the lights, which were waist level before, rose up. They rose as eyes would on a bear standing onto its hind legs, instantly reducing me to a quivering mess. Odd thing is, bears don't have antlers. I haven't ever heard of a moose with piercing eyes that can stand on its hind legs either. As soon as it began straightening up, I was already getting out of there. I just ran. Luckily, I managed to kick my phone out of the dirt and quickly picked it up. The flashlight was still going, making it really easy to spot once I kicked it. Rolling through the woods, illuminating phone now in my hand, I made it back to my campfire completely out of breath. Now, normally I'd spray this story all over my friends, but I knew they'd just think I'd went crazy or hit my head collecting wood. Also, considering I didn't have a bundle of sticks anymore, my shortness of breath was probably a little unjustified. I sat down and noticed that my friend from before was still being very strange, but it seemed like with every passing minute he was adapting more to the conversation and was steadily attempting to contribute more and more. We're all good friends, which is why I find this unusual, considering the fact that he legitimately could not speak English 1 minute, and then within 15 he's practically back to normal. Still, something was off. He was the last to leave the campfire, even after the other guys had pissed it out, and he just stayed there staring at the ashes. After most of us had gotten home, he calls me. An entire minute of silence. The whole time I'm shouting at him to tell me where he is, and that if he's too drunk to get home, I'll go and find him. Disturbingly, he just hangs up. After a cigarette and another half a beer, he calls me back again. This time he's trying to talk like before, but he can't pronounce any words again. He never did touch that case of beer he brought, by the way. Just sat next to him during the whole fire. So I tell him to stop being an idiot and to tell me where he is. He hangs up again, leaving me to figure that he's just drunk, emotional, and that maybe I was just being a little too harsh on him. Honestly though, I was just so shaken up and I needed to confide to somebody about what I had just seen. But he was incapacitated and it frustrated me. After that, I went to bed and I figured he was just being strangely drunk. It was insanely weird to me, but I had a few drinks too and I wasn't really having any of his crap and I figured I'd try to get some sleep. When I wake up in the morning, I have a text from his roommate asking me why he saw him crawl from underneath his car in the driveway this morning. We haven't seen him since, and his roommate said he thought he'd never made it home because he didn't come in. So, what's wrong with my friend? I'm hoping he comes back because if he doesn't, my buddy just got his skin and carjacked by a flesh gate or something. So now I'm scared. Sorry for the long post, I just needed to vent and tell the story properly as I remember it. Update. He came back home around 8:30 p.m. last night looking a little shaken up, but otherwise normal. He seems fine for now. This happened last night, so for the past 2 days, I've been reading a lot about skinwalkers. I've scourged the top posts of all time and read every single story from there, and also the local news for skinwalker stories. I live in NWT. It's the province about Alberta, about 200,000 in population, beautiful in the summer. We're surrounded by the woods and lots of lakes. There's one particular trail people often drive to access said lakes. Anyway, last night I was driving on the trail with a guy friend to find a secluded spot. He recommended V Lake, which was the first lake you access on the trail system. The way it's set up, there's a long narrow dirt road at the right of the highway that you have to drive for at least 20 minutes before you get to the lake itself. The dirt road is surrounded by trees and is riddled with little lakes here and there. It's my favorite lake to drive to, mostly because I love the narrow dirt roads with lots of tall trees. So it's Sunday night and we're the only ones driving. We weren't high or drunk, we were just having fun, listening to music. Then as I was driving, about 10 minutes into the dirt road, an extremely strong smell of rotten flesh filled our noses. This weirded my friend out and made me panic. The first thing that came to my mind was skinwalkers. It was vile and the smell just hit us all of a sudden. The windows were closed and the AC was set to the lowest. The car is clean and nothing there could have caused it. I asked him what he thought of the smell. He said barbecue. I told him there's a current fire ban in effect in the city. That can't be. He agreed and he said it smelled really rotten to him. The smell was strong. It was making me nauseous. I'm now more aware of the woods surrounding us. How it actually makes me feel kind of claustrophobic. How every turn and curve makes me more and more anxious. My gut was telling me something isn't right, and I kept thinking skinwalkers and the stories I've read up for the past 2 days. I was getting more scared by the moment. Then we drove through another curve and my lights and high beams shone quickly on a person standing inside the mouth of the woods, and that's when I panicked. I asked my friend, "Do you still want to drive down this road?" "Yeah, I don't care," he replied. During this time, I seriously knew something wasn't right and my brain kept screaming at me to turn around. I kept glancing at my mirrors. Frank Ocean's voice wasn't calming me down. I was so scared. I think he saw my discomfort, so he piped up again. "We can turn around if you want." I slammed on my brakes and did a 4-point turn and hightailed it out of there. Once we were back on the highway of the trail, I told him about what I thought of the smell, but not the person I saw in the woods. I didn't want to freak him out. We had a long conversation about it. I knew we shouldn't have, but he kept asking questions because he was curious, so I answered, but tried not to mention its name. Also, while we were there, we were parked at the picnic ground of a lake, and little stones started hitting the driver's side of the truck. A couple would hit every minute or so. It unnerved the crap out of me, but I ignored it. There was no one else in the trail because we didn't hear or see anyone driving. That was kind of weird too. One statement of his that kind of unnerved me was, I think it was trying to lure us further into the woods. So on the way back, I had him drive so I could calm down. I was calmer on the drive back. There were some foxes with glowing eyes in the middle of the road that kind of freaked me out at first, but then I realized they're just foxes. Also saw roadkill by the immediate side of the road that wasn't there before, which was pretty weird. It was about the size of a beaver, but really nothing to panic about, I think. So yeah, this all happened from 1 to 3 a.m. last night. I now really believe in skinwalkers. Just wasn't expecting on encountering one. My uncle, aunt, and all my cousins live in Utah, like 2 states over from me, California. They drive around a lot, especially for family reunions. My uncle often tells all the kids and everyone else a story when we go camping, mostly since someone usually wants to hear it again. He was driving back home alone one night in the summer. He knew the area well and he wasn't worried, but he was still kind of creeped out from, well, driving alone at night. He was in a long road, sparse, deserty area with the hills and bushes. My uncle then heard a weird noise, like a chirp or something. The way he described it was the first part of the he that Michael Jackson makes, without the second he. It sounds very ridiculous, I know, but unsettling in the cold, dark outdoors. And it seemed clear enough to not have just been creaking metal, or something like that. Obviously, he got a little weirded out by it. He's a lively, tough dude with the company of others, but he hates being alone. My uncle heard it from somewhat far away, but then he started hearing it again, and it was almost ramping up, getting faster. It was also getting slightly louder. He sped up, but it still continued to get closer. He looked to the left outside his window and saw something running almost parallel to his truck, pretty far off the road but inside the bush area, upright like a tall, skinny human. He said it was brown and furry, and it just bothered him. It wasn't horror movie monster scary, but it was something's wrong scary. He heard the moving of leaves. The noise was now basically constant. It sounded different, like a person sounds when they're tired and speak every syllable in one breath of air. The animal thing sort of faded into the plants. The thing was, though, he didn't feel any less scared, since now he feared it was in front of him, and that he would see it clearly on the road, but nothing happened for the rest of the ride. He usually clears out the night with his story. Camping stories are fun, but they're sort of harmless. This one gets everyone creeped out and thinking, something that wouldn't have gone away if he told the story earlier. For a little background on my story, I live in a small town outside of Kansas City, Kansas. But the area I live in has lots of history around it, and there was a lot of Native American activity in the area. My house has a long driveway, and is in the middle of a stand of woods. The woods have been there as long as there's records of the area. When we first moved into our home, everything seemed pretty normal, but after living there a month, that's when abnormal stuff started to happen. Pounding on the roof, animal scratches on our vehicles, and we started finding a lot of dead animals on the property. We even contacted Kansas State game wardens, but couldn't find any evidence of poaching or poisoning, or even the animals getting hit by cars. So after about 2 years of this, my older brother moves back in and brings his dog with him. One night at about 11 p.m. the dog starts whining to be let out, so I put him on the leash and let him walk around the yard. Suddenly, he starts trying to yank me back towards the house. This uneasy feeling washes over me and I notice something that smells like rotting catfish guts. I feel like someone was watching me, so I turn around, and down by our garage, just inside the light, I see this figure. It was about 5 feet tall, hunched over, and it was very pale. It had small, deep, beady eyes and had a deer-like face. A sense of pure terror washed over me. I've never been more scared of anything in my life, and to this day, I've never felt that level of fear. I ran back into the house to wake up my dad and brother. They grab some shotguns and run outside to check it out. All they find are some pretty deep scratch marks on the garage. We contacted the game wardens the next day. I described what I saw and smelt, and they said it was probably a very sick deer that had contracted some sort of illness or something of that sort. Weird stuff kept happening for another 2 or 3 years. Then we had a really bad drought and stuff stopped occurring. So I don't know what the hell I saw that night. I was wondering if anyone had seen or smelled anything similar to that. When I was 12 years old, my 15-year-old brother and I experienced a very horrific event while at our grandparents' cabin. My grandparents own a cabin on a rather large island in southern Sweden, which contains only 2 cabins, separated by slightly less than a mile. One summer, my brother and I, along with my mother and sister, went to visit them for a weekend. The thing we did most during our days there was go fishing. On the first day of our stay, we were planning to fish. We set everything up. All we had to do now was go dig for worms, which we used for bait. Grabbing a shovel along with a bucket, we went back up to the cabin and down a short slope and through a trail where we usually find plenty of worms. The forest is very dense and barely any light shines through, which makes the whole setting a bit unnerving for me, as I have always been easily frightened. I hear something walking and I look at my brother with a very scared face. He brushes it off as if there was nothing to be afraid of, and insists that we go check it out. We walk a bit further down the trail, which I know leads to an open meadow, as I have been there looking for mushrooms with my mom at a previous occasion. Before we get to the open, my brother holds up his hands as to indicate for me to stop. I looked over his shoulder and see behind the trees what appears to be a moose looking directly at us. I got relieved as I knew they were friendly, and as I had seen plenty of moose nearby. My brother, however, who has never been scared of anything, looks back at me with the biggest eyes I've ever seen, and the most pale I've ever seen someone, as he tells me we should get out of here. Without questioning him, I start to walk back while he keeps pushing me as to make me move quicker, and as we reach the cabin, we are pretty much running. My mom and grandma were sitting at the porch as we got into the front, and I tell them that we saw a moose. My brother, on the other hand, remains completely silent. Safe to say that there was no fishing that day. The following day, we didn't even bring up fishing. I'm sitting on the porch reading a magazine, and my brother is sitting inside on the couch doing the same, although he still has the scared look in his eyes. I spend the following hour or two reading several magazines until my grandpa asks me where the shovel is. I realize that we left it where we were looking for worms the previous day, and I tell him where it is. Just as he was about to go and get it, my mother tells me that my brother and I have to go get it, since we left it there. She also tells me that we should go dig up some worms, as she wants to go fishing later with us. I don't question it, but my brother seems unnerved by it. This made everything all the more unsettling for me, as my brother is not easily scared at all, pretty much the opposite of me. We put on our shoes and head to the back of the cabin and walk down the trail heading to where the shovel and bucket is. Once we are about 10 feet from where the shovel is, my brother stops and tells me I should go and dig, as he did it the last time. I do as he says and I start digging for worms. I have this very strong feeling that he stayed back because he was scared something would happen. I start hearing the bushes around me sway, and I hear sneaky footsteps moving closer and closer. Everything is all the more creepy as I have no idea where the footsteps are coming from. 1 second I'm sure they're coming from my right, the next it feels like they're coming from a completely opposite direction. I quickly put a few worms that I found in the bucket, and as I fumble to pick up the shovel, I feel as I'm being watched. My brother walks up to me and helps me seal the bucket, and I tell him it feels like someone is watching, to which he responds that we should leave. Just as we turn around and are ready to head back, I hear a crack from behind me and turn around. I look down the trail and see the moose once again, peeking at me from behind a tree. It looked very different from what they usually look like, as it felt much slimmer and sort of twisted. At the time, I'm more confused and curious than I am scared, and my brother is dead silent. I can't quite see the whole body of it, but I know that something is wrong. I stand for a couple more seconds watching it, as it is staring right at us. From what I can see, I realize that it's not standing on its 4 legs. It is leaned forward, as an old man with really bad posture, with its arms hanging straight down. I also had a weird sensation that the creature was trying to talk to me, saying, "Let me help you." In a few seconds, I get struck with panic, and start walking really fast back to the cabin, my brother doing the same. It only takes a second before we are both in a full sprint running back to the cabin. I turn around and the moose-like creature is nowhere to be seen. We put the shovel by the shed where we took it, and bring the bucket of worms to the front where my mom and grandparents are. The day goes on as if nothing had happened, and we don't speak of it at all. Since this happened, I never thought I'd bring it up with my brother. We both just sort of knew that it would feel wrong to speak about it, and none of us had visited my grandparents' cabin since. To this day, I'm not sure at all what I saw. I mentioned it to my friend once, and he told me if what I said was true, then it was probably a Wendigo or a skinwalker. He showed me some pictures from Google, and I instantly found resemblances of the creature that I saw back then. Until recently, I had completely repressed this event. But after reading several stories about Wendigo and skinwalkers, my mind has once again become haunted by this event. And in a terrible way, I realized that what I most likely saw was something far more horrific than a moose. Out of all the things I've read about Wendigo, the most terrifying thing is that people say never to talk to it. I'm just imagining in my head what could have happened if I tried talking back to the creature when I felt it was speaking to me. Part 2. Alright, so some people asked me to share more regarding the events that happened when I was visiting my grandparents' cabin. I have not been there since, but my grandmother and her new husband stay there every summer. Note that this is about 6 years ago since the moose incident. Through the magic of Facebook, I contacted my grandma. We don't know each other all too well anymore, so I don't really feel comfortable calling her. I told her about the moose-like creature and how my brother and I both saw it. She proceeded by typing for nearly 15 minutes, and I waited patiently. Her reply was a full story of her own encounter with what she said she had hoped to be just a dysfunctional moose. Her writing was in Swedish, so I will do my best to translate it. About 20 years ago, I was staying in the cabin by myself. Your grandpa was working at the time, so I was alone for the whole week. One night, while I was sleeping, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. I wasn't sure why, but I just knew something was wrong. I felt as if I was being watched. My first thought was to fall back asleep, and so I did. I woke up in what I believe was about an hour, and this time I was sure something wasn't as it should be. I felt the same feeling of being watched, and I could clearly hear something moving outside. I grab my bedside candle and light it. As I get out of bed, I choose to not pull the curtains as I have a terrifying feeling that someone will be staring right at me. By now, I am convinced that something is trying to rob me. I was sleeping in the room at the back of the cabin, and so I walked up to the front and looked out by the porch, but see nothing. There are no neighbors nearby, and I can't call the police as I don't have a phone. I decide to go back to bed and try to sleep the fear away. I lay there for at least an hour without falling asleep. And although the sound is gone, the unpleasant feeling has stuck around. At the backside of the cabin, right outside my window, was an older cabin, which was used before this one was built. The place was creepy, and we eventually decided to burn it down some years later. Anyways, I hear something bumping around side of it, and I realize that I'm gonna have to look out the window. I get out of bed, light the candle again, and pull the curtains. The uneasy feeling is still there, and I have the strongest feeling that something is going to stare right back at me. I pull the curtains, and for a complete second I am caught in complete terror. I see something staring right back at me, but it's no robber. It's not a person. It's a moose. I expected to be relieved to find that it was nothing but a harmless animal, but that is far from what I was. After a few seconds, I calmed down, and the panic faded a bit. The thing was still staring at me, but it was sure not a normal moose. I took a few seconds to investigate it. For a first, it was not standing on 4 legs. It was bent forward, as if in the upper front legs were just barely floating above the ground. It was also much slimmer than moose usually are, and it had this sort of disturbing twist in the body. The antlers looked flat out terrifying. Naturally, it doesn't say anything, but I had this strong feeling that it wanted me to come out. It wanted me to let it help me. Although I felt that's what it wanted me to hear, I just knew the thing had bad intentions. I faint within a few seconds, and I wake up in the morning and let out a scream of panic. The creature is gone, and I am contemplating whether or not I was dreaming. To this day, I was unsure if this actually happened, or if I was just dreaming. Now that I know you saw the same thing, I know it was real. My grandma suggested that I tell my brother that I spoke to her about it, and I am seriously considering doing so. I mean, this for sure confirms that what we saw was not a normal moose. I had some thoughts thinking it might have just been a handicapped or dysfunctional moose. But by the way my grandma said it tried to communicate with her and convince her, I knew it was the same thing that my brother and I encountered, as it too tried to talk to us. Apparently, she had already told this story to my mom and grandpa, but they just brushed it off and said it was either an injured moose or she was dreaming. Hearing about this story just made me all the more scared, but at the same time curious about what the creature actually was, and what was its purpose. Was he trying to lure us into the forest? Was he actually trying to help us with something? Hopefully I get some more clarification the more I talk to people about it. I ended up sending some pictures of Wendigo and Skinwalkers to her, and she definitely saw resemblances between them. That all sent shivers down my spine. To all of the people reading this, if you ever encounter a weird-looking creature with antlers, do not speak with it, or even acknowledge their presence. That's what they want. So this is a story about an experience I had late last year. I was in Dorset, UK, the night before Christmas Eve. Opinions are welcome as I can't really explain it, and everyone I tell the story to thinks I'm just crazy or I'm making it up. What makes me think this may not be a skinwalker is that I've always heard that they won't enter a person's home unless you specifically invite them in, unless it took the open window as an invitation. In addition, I have nothing which to explain the orb and flashes unless I'm really losing my mind. Either way, I don't claim to have any literary ability. I also didn't know anything about skinwalkers until I tried to figure out what this thing was. I'll just tell it like I experienced it. I was staying with my parents for a while in my old bedroom. We had picked up the house cheaply just 3 years prior, when its former elderly owner suddenly passed away in one of the bedrooms. A friend and I had been hanging out for a week or so, enjoying the holiday, playing video games, going for short walks with my sister's dog on the nearby beach surrounding the fields. On the 22nd of December, this friend left to go spend Christmas with his own family, and not knowing what to do with my newfound bedroom for the evening, I decided to go to sleep early, around 9 p.m. for a change. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor, and my window was left open a few inches to let in a cool breeze. My sleep was restless. I kept waking and re-entering sleep every half hour until around midnight, when I finally drift off for good, or so I thought. Now, I don't often have dreams, and if I do, I don't remember much of them, but the dream that I had this night was stranger than the others, and it is relevant to the rest of the story. I was seeing through the eyes of another person as they emerged from a bush in one of my neighbor's gardens. They were steadily and silently approaching my own garden, climbing over a 6-foot wooden fence as easily as you or I climb a set of stairs. I couldn't see any hands or feet. It was as if it was a Steadicam just gliding over the ground. My sister's dog was asleep on the tiny patch of grass near the tree, and I came to a stop directly beneath my open window. The viewpoint then switched to resting on a branch near the top of the tree in my garden, watching the back of a pale white humanoid figure silently glide up the side of my house and looking at me through my open window. This is where I woke up, covered in a cold sweat, and decided that I should just lay there for a while with my eyes closed. All I could hear was the wind in the trees outside, as I thought about the dream, hoping to remember some more of it. Without warning, the silence was broken by my sister's dog barking like crazy. About 10 seconds later, it turned to yelping before fading into silence once more. Thinking it was squirrels or something else spooking the dog, I planned to go back to sleep, but then I start to hear slow scratching sounds on the wooden paneling on the outside of the house. It only covers the 2nd floor, so I reasoned that it couldn't have been my sister's dog. So I sat up, intending to take a look outside, pausing momentarily to glance sideways at the radio clock illuminating the room with its yellow-orange glow, and of course, it's 3:33 a.m. exactly. This is when the unexplainable intense fear washes over me, stronger than I have ever felt before or since. It definitely felt like something was in the room with me, like I was somehow intruding or being watched. I thought I could hear a low murmuring coming from all around me. I saw something move across the ceiling and come to rest behind the room's main light shade. I closed my eyes and laid down again for reasons I can't explain even now, as if I was being willed by an outside force. Then, with my eyes still closed, a floating white orb appeared roughly where I had seen the shadow on the ceiling, accompanied by the sound of 1,000 lighters being sparked at once. It was almost deafening. There was a bright white flash that filled the room with light that I could clearly see with my eyes still closed. As the flash subsided, I was left in total darkness again. I immediately sat upright, wondering what just happened. Slowly, I reached for the bedside light with my right arm, and it wouldn't turn on. Memories of unplugging it so my friend could recharge his laptop at some point earlier in the week came flooding back to me. It was only then when I was made fully aware of the dark humanoid figure now standing completely motionless in the center of my room, beneath the main light, as it unnaturally snapped its head to the left to watch my arm reaching for the light. It slowly turned its head back onto me, and I couldn't make out any facial features. It was as if its skin absorbed all light like a black hole. I stayed there for a good 2 minutes, just paralyzed in fear, not really comprehending what it was I was looking at. Then it abruptly, in a very jerking, unnatural movements, took a single step towards me and extended its open hand, ending in long, almost talon-like fingers. As it came even closer, I felt fear increase proportionally to its distance from me. It was almost touching my face when fight-or-flight mode engaged. Without even thinking, I jumped out of bed and slammed on the wall to turn on the main light switch. My head flicked back to cast a fresh eye on the thing, where inside of a fraction of a second, it crossed the room and threw itself out the open window, clearing the garden in a single jump before disappearing into the night at an impossible speed. I went downstairs to check on the rest of the house, and to make sure my parents were okay. Into the garden, I found my sister's dog whining softly, and attempting to hide behind the tree, shaking. I can't stop thinking back to that experience and wondering what would have happened if I stayed put, or even taken its hand. I've always been a bit of a skeptic, ever since I was a kid. Scary stories don't faze me, creepy games never frighten me, and whenever I hear something weird at night, I instantly assume it's something normal, an animal, or just the house settling. Despite this, something very unsettling happened to me the other day, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. I think it's the first time in years I've been genuinely frightened. I live in a forest area in the US. Me and my girlfriend live in a large cabin, and although there are no roads nearby, our nearest neighbors are at least a mile away. We also have 2 cats, one of which sleeps in the bedroom with us, while the other often goes out at night and does whatever cats do when they're out of sight. Anyway, I like to stay up late at night and sleep late into the morning, whereas my girlfriend's an early bird. It was 1 in the morning and I was watching a crappy TV in the living room while my girlfriend slept in the bedroom. I was beginning to grow tired when I heard something outside, near the cat door. For clarity, our cat door uses an electronic chip, so only our cats can use it. I assumed it was just one of the cats coming in or leaving the house, and I just ignored it. Then I heard it again. It sounded like something thudding against the cat door. It happened several times at random intervals, until I lost my patience and decided to go open the door. Clearly, the cat was having trouble getting in. I never thought about it at the time, but it was weird because we feed our cats well, and they're very lean rather than chubby. I passed the bedroom and peered in as I walked past, to see if my girlfriend heard the noises. She was fast asleep, but the cat that sleeps with us was staring at the window. I call her name. Nothing. She keeps staring. I shrugged it off and kept heading towards the kitchen. The back doors are through there, by the way. Anyway, so I reached the back door and saw a dark shape through the translucent door. I sighed, expecting the cat to be out there, and opened the door. It took me a moment to open the door, and I saw the cat tense up as I opened it. The door opened fully. I froze. It wasn't my cat. Whatever it was had started moving before I opened it up. I only caught a glimpse of a distorted figure, kind of like a tailless dog, bolting, and I mean absolutely pelting it. I freaked out and slammed the door shut. What the hell was it? I wasn't sure. My natural skepticism kicked in, and I assumed it was just my other cat, and I had merely startled it. Perhaps the darkness made it appear larger. Nevertheless, I was creeped out, and I decided to go to sleep. As I slipped into bed, I realized something horrifying. The second cat was asleep on the rug. It took a while to get to sleep that night. Everything seemed normal until a few hours later, I awoke to a strange feeling of dread. Something wasn't right. My girlfriend was fast asleep. I held my breath and heard something creaking by the door. It sounded too loud to be one of the cats. It was as if a person was walking about. I reached toward my bedside cabinet and flicked on the lamp. The room was illuminated and I saw something just standing outside the door, staring at me. The same twisted figure I had spotted earlier outside. It wasn't very tall, maybe a little over 5 feet, but it was its face that scared me the most. I only caught a glimpse of it, but what I saw will stay with me forever. It looked like a dog, but with an elongated face and almost human-like eyes. You know that weird, distorted snarl dogs pull when they're pissed off? It had that expression. I instantly started yelling profanities as I scrabbled backwards, trying to straighten up. The creature turned and sprinted down the hall. I heard it dash outside and go past the window behind us, just above the headboard. I managed to look out as my girlfriend started to panic as she woke up fully. We both caught a glimpse of whatever the hell that thing was as it dashed off into the woods near our home. Grabbing my trusty shotgun from underneath the bed, as well as a couple rounds from the ammunition box that sits next to it, I ran out of the room in my underwear and rounded into the kitchen. The door was open. I'd forgotten to lock it when I saw the thing originally. I haven't seen it since, but we still live in our cabin. But I've bought sturdy locks for all the main doors and windows in the house, and always check the exit points at night. I also go to bed a bit earlier than I used to, so I'm asleep when the freaks of the night start to wake up. I've read a bunch of forums, and the only thing that I can compare it to, based on what I saw, is a skinwalker. If you know anything about these things, please let me know. As I am writing you this, other skinwalkers are in front of my house. They are surrounding me. If I die, I want you to know what happened. I stand alone, nobody to help me. I hear them howling. By my estimation, there are at least 5 of them. But let's tell the story from the beginning, shall we? My childhood was nice. It was going smooth and buttery until my 8th birthday. After a long day and a party with my friends, summer heat slowly disappeared as the night came on. I was out in the backyard playing with my Spider-Man figure. I was feeling safe and happy, until my dog shot across the yard and ran off into the forest. I should probably describe the dog. He was a big Siberian Husky, white. His name was Johnny. Anyways, back to the story. The dog shocked me. Then in a second, I went from feeling safe to feeling like I could die at any moment. Right then, fog rolled into my backyard. I could see the outline of a figure standing in it. Then, a wolf howled. It sounded like a wolf at first, but it sounded wrong. I screamed for my dad, who came out running. I told him about Johnny and the wolf howling. He then said, "Son, there's no wolves in this country." He ushered me inside and grabbed his shotgun and went searching for Johnny. He came back empty-handed, but I knew something happened, that he saw something. I could see it in his eyes. That night, he stayed awake on the couch, gripping his shotgun until the sun came up. From that point on, every night the fog would roll in our backyard, and the figure would start howling. As I grew older, I could not be convinced by my father it was just a wolf. So, on one winter evening, he sat me down in the couch by the fireplace and told me a story. Son, long before men ruled the earth, other creatures lived on it. So, naturally, when we came, they felt angry. They wanted to get rid of us. That thing you see every night howling is one of them. They are called skinwalkers. They are sort of shapeshifters. They can take the shape of a human or animal. Also, they take their memories, their voice, their life. But you can always recognize the skinwalker from the real deal. When they speak, there is something wrong in their voice, a certain amount of something sinister. My son, I have dealt with skinwalkers all my life. Looks like you'll have to do that too. He then gave me an unmarked red leather-bound book and told me to read it in its entirety. And so I began. In it was everything about skinwalkers. How do they live, and what they do, what do they feed on, and how to hunt them. My father then moved away to the city when I was 20. He knew then I could guard the front line. Fast forward a few days ago, I was in the backyard of the same house. Me, now a fully grown male, 25 years old, I was guarding, and an idea came to my mind. I'm gonna catch that skinwalker. So I prepared my traps, some signs, and put my lucky necklace on my neck. I poured holy water everywhere, in the sprinklers too, put salt in my shotgun gauges, also in my sniper rifle rounds. Night came, and by my expectations, at around 10 p.m. the fog came in. What was driving me to hunt this skinwalker was this. I can't have a family with this thing around us. Why, you may ask, because this skinwalker didn't do anything to me. Wrong. He got my dog. My dad found it in the creek a few days later after he was hunting. He took a good friend of mine. I didn't want my kids to live a life like me, to be scared constantly, to not have a teenage life just because this thing came every night and attacked my house. So when the fog came, I got ready on my roof and waited. After only 10 minutes of waiting, it was here. He started doing as usual, howling and throwing stuff at my house, mostly animal carcasses. And then, out of nowhere, I turned the sprinklers on. It screamed so hard it was shaking my house. Then I shot at it with my silver bullet with some salt. It came down, but I knew it wasn't dead. It was just unconscious. I then came down from the roof. I didn't turn off the sprinklers. I picked the thing up. It must have weighed around 300 pounds. But I was a huge dude, 6'8". I have trained for this my entire life. I was ready. I took it into my basement and strapped it into a chair, placed in a cage that had electricity running through its bars. I then waited for it to wake up. When it did, it started howling immediately. It changed from its wolf shape to one of my dead friends just to hurt me. I left it there to rot. But then, it started howling again. It called another. This brings me to this moment. It's still howling. They are surrounding me. I have ammo and food in my bunker. My house was built like a fortress, but the chance of survival is small. I will try to stop them, to save you. So if I die here, take my example. Be prepared for everything. Last night, I had an experience with what I believe to be a skinwalker. I was sleeping on my couch. I'm in the process of remodeling my bedroom. It had been storming on and off all night, but in that moment, the wind was only blowing. It was about 1 in the morning when I was woken up by a very strange noise. I can't describe it that well, but it sounded like an animal call, except as if a human was making the sound. It was a long, deep noise that kept on going, almost like a foghorn. It sounded like it was right outside my window, in my backyard. In case you're wondering, I live in a country near the Ozark Mountains, and directly on the Trail of Tears. I've lived out there, in the middle of the woods my whole life. I've heard and seen everything: bears, deer, cougars, raccoons, coyotes. But the sound that I heard that night wasn't like anything that I've ever heard. I'm not going to lie. It scared the absolute hell out of me. I immediately went to my bedroom. I have a window that looks into my backyard as well. I wanted to see whatever it was, but I didn't want to pull back my living room curtains to come face to face with it. I couldn't see anything through my bedroom window, so I turned around and started walking back to the living room. Then something hit my window. It wasn't strong enough to break it, it just sounded like someone hit the palm of their hand on the glass. At that point, I went back to sleep and ignored the sound. Looking back on it, I should have recorded it, and I tried when the noise came back the next night, but every time I took out my phone, it stopped. Today, I built up enough courage to go into my backyard and to investigate. There were loose limbs everywhere. I had a bonfire a few weeks ago. The remaining ashes had been dug through, not blown by the wind or damaged by the rain. No, it looked like something took their hands and dug a hole. I did some research, and I think it's a skinwalker. I'm no stranger to these things. I've heard lots of stories about them, and considering that I've seen several things walking through the woods through my lifetime, I'm starting to become really convinced. So this happened to me last September, and I'm writing about it now, only because I've read so many experiences people have had that I'm at a point where I'm more comfortable talking about what happened. My best friends live out by a country farmland in Michigan. The land is very old and probably traces back to the Native Americans. There is even a nearby road called Indian Trail. Well, it was around 1:30 a.m. and I was leaving their house. And to paint a visual of what their yard looks like, the driveway is in the shape of a U, and they have many cars parked except for this one part near the front of the house where there is a giant evergreen tree nobody ever parks in front of, and a light that hangs over to illuminate this area. Where my car was parked is the furthest to the left, and I have to walk across the entire yard and past the tree in order to get to my car. Well, as I left that night, I reached about the center of the yard and suddenly felt my heart rate was skyrocketing. This happened out of nowhere, and I started running to get to my car as fast as I could. As I got into my car, my front windows were foggy, and as I started the car, there was a small patch clearing up at the bottom of the windshield where I could see clearly. And that's when I saw the thing squatting by the evergreen tree and watching me. I have never had that feeling as though my body was burning at 300 degrees and my heart was in my throat throbbing. I looked through that small patch of my window, which was now growing larger, and the thing wasn't moving. It was still frozen in place and squatting. It was not human, and it was not animal either. My body went numb. All of this happened in a matter of 30 seconds, and I backed out of the driveway and drove down the dirt road to get home, probably driving 70 miles an hour. I immediately repressed what happened to that point, and I don't even remember how I got home. The next day comes around, and I go over to their house again, and I was sitting in my friend's room, and I told her that I saw something in her yard last night. And she freaked out at me because she said it could have been a robber or a dangerous person. And I told her no, it wasn't a person. I described it as the khaki man, because it looked like those saggy khaki tan pants, but only the entire body was that texture. The head was bald with ears folded into the scalp, and pitch black beady eyes, like round buttons. Well, her husband overheard me talking about this, and he entered the room halfway into the story and waited for me to finish, and told me that him, his dad and brother have all seen it at once, and they called it Gollum, like the creature from the Lord of the Rings. I didn't know what it was, and they showed me a figurine of it, and it had similar resemblance to it. None of them ever seen it more than once. I told them that I didn't want to know anything more about it, and I tried to erase that this ever happened because it literally flipped my entire perception of this world around. Anything is possible. And while I've had paranormal experiences growing up as a child, I wasn't too scared about things like that. But to come across a creature that is not something my brain could have ever comprehended at this point, I believe that all kinds of things are out there. But all this time has passed since and I'm still traumatized from it. I don't want to live in fear, and I still visit my friends frequently. But ever since then, they always walk me out if I'm leaving late at night. After a couple months passed, I decided that I wanted to know what it was that I saw. And after diving deep into online forums of people's paranormal experiences, I came across a story mentioning the term skinwalker, which I never heard before, so I decided to look it up, and that's what sparked my interest on researching more. I have read tons of stories online about encounters others have had with skinwalkers, which led me to research more about Navajo Native American folklore, and the one who walks on all fours. A part of me thinks that it could have certainly been that, but another part of me is not so sure, because this thing almost looked alien, and not so much like a coyote, although we often hear coyotes in this area late at night. I described what this looked like to my friend who lives at the house, and she illustrated a spot-on picture of it that I'll attach here. I would love to hear from any of you with possible insight related to the subject of skinwalkers, as well as if you've seen anything like this. I have had some nightmares from it, and have thought about possibly talking to a Native American shaman who owns a shop nearby, but I'm not sure how I could approach a topic like that because it's a topic they don't like to speak about, which is why I wanted to share it here first. I told this story to some friends tonight after not thinking about it for a while and remembered how odd and creepy it really is. The man who told me about this terrifying experience in the Colorado wilderness is one of those distinct relatives that everyone has. They're your third cousin, twice removed, or something to that effect. I'm not positive exactly how we're related, but he's an incredible guy. I'll call him Greg. Greg is a decorated Green Beret with a silver star to his name that he earned by capturing the leader of an Afghan sniper cell without incurring any casualties. Despite his status of a huge badass, and not his inconsiderable size, 6'3", 200 pounds, Greg is a teddy bear, just an extremely humble, kind person. I have a lot of experience in the outdoors and have lived in Colorado for most of my life, and Greg and I had an extended conversation about our adventures in the woods at my grandmother's house for Thanksgiving. We were sitting on the couch wearing tacky holiday sweaters when a conversation turned to hunting. Greg mentioned offhand that he used to be an avid hunter, but had an experience that turned him off to it. He doesn't even like guns anymore, something I found surprising coming from an accomplished soldier. I pushed him to tell me what happened, and though he seemed uncomfortable with the idea, he finally did. I'm going to switch to first person now and try to write exactly what Greg told me. It was late October, which means elk season is up in the Indian Peaks wilderness, and I went up there to bag a few elk and just relax for a few days by myself. I parked the truck near a trailhead about 8 miles from where I would end up setting up camp, and was looking forward to the nice weekend in the woods with some nice peace and quiet after packing all my gear and getting ready. The first morning, I was in my deer blind, about 20 feet up in a tree with a cup of coffee and my rifle. The sun had just come up an hour or so ago. About 50 yards from my tree, the tree line ended and opened up into a big meadow where a lot of elk tended to roll through, and I could sight my rifle pretty well through the trees and could see most of the big grassy area. Maybe a couple hours had passed, which really isn't boring that deep in the woods. I just drank my coffee from my thermos and listened to the life around me, feeling the woods getting ready for winter. I couldn't believe my luck when I glanced over the meadow and saw a large group of elk had started grazing in the meadow. The silent animals plodded along, munching at the grass, oblivious to me watching. Among the group was one of the most beautiful elk I had ever seen. It was called a monarch, which means its antlers had 8 points each, something really rare. I quietly clicked the safety off my rifle and sighted in on it. When you're hunting an animal like this, you want to put the bullet right where the skull meets the spine, in order to sever the spinal column and kill it instantly and painlessly. The focus when you get in the zone is incredible. I swear I could feel the firing pin punch forward and the bullet leave the barrel as I pulled the trigger. That beautiful elk went down silently, and all the others scattered for the tree line. I was ecstatic about the shot and the elk as I climbed down the tree and set off for the meadow. I had left my rifle up in the tree, something I regretted soon, and I had only a small knife on me to gut the animal and drag it back to camp. As I was making the short walk between my tree and the meadow, I noticed that the woods around me were completely silent. Some of this is normal after you fire a gun in the woods, but for it to drag on this long was unsettling. I thought nothing of it and continued the short walk through the dense pines. As I was about to clear the trees and step into the meadow, I noticed something odd. I could see the elk's body lying in the grass through the trees, but there was something else there. There was what looked like another elk, antlers and all, on the opposite side of the dead elk from where I was coming to walk out of the tree line, almost looking as though it was gently nuzzling the other elk's dead body. This was weird. To see another elk treat a dead elk like this, they usually just scatter, but I continued to walk towards it, hollering in an attempt to startle the other elk off. It snapped its head up and looked at me. Over the body of its fallen friend, the strange new elk eyed me with its unafraid glare. I say glare because it didn't feel like an animal looking at me anymore. Its glassy black eyes gave me the same caught red-handed feeling that you got when your parents catch you when you're doing something wrong. I felt suddenly uncomfortable, out of place into the woods that I loved so much, and somehow hated and guilty. I no longer wanted the elk. I stopped dead in my tracks and watched this animal as it eyed me angrily. What it did next gives me nightmares to this day. It stood up, and it was not an elk. The thing that stood before me on the other side of the dead elk must have been lying on its stomach, and put its arms down and pushed up, putting its legs under it. It reared back, glaring at me all along with its evil, glass eyes. My breath caught in my throat. Most of its body was at least somewhat human, but terribly emaciated and elongated. It appeared to stand 10 feet tall, not including the antlers atop of the elk head. It was bald everywhere but the neck up, and looked sickly pale pink. Its legs and knees bent backwards, like the back legs of an elk. This horrible, skinny, naked, unnatural thing just stood there, glaring at me with a hatred that was palpable. The woods around us were silent. It might have been seconds, minutes, or hours. I felt the disapproving parent feeling shift. I felt more like an ant under a shoe. I took a step back. My boots felt like 10 pounds. My body felt numb, and the noise of my footsteps was ear-splitting. I took one more and then turned and ran. Running through those thick woods is tough, but I ran faster than I ever have in my life. I passed under my tree with my $4,000 rifle still sitting in it without even slowing down. I ran all the way back to my camp, which must have been a mile, before I stopped for a breath. It took me another minute to dare to look behind me. I was alone, but the woods around me were still silent and brooding. I wanted more than anything to pack up and go home, but I knew that I would not likely make it back to the car before nightfall, and I did not want to be exposed at night. I cooked an MRE in my tent and stayed there the rest of the day. When night fell, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop myself from staring at every little noise. I kept thinking about the possible rational explanations for what I saw. Maybe there's a crazy guy out there who found an elk head and is wearing it around scaring people. But no explanation came up when I quailed the maddening fear that I felt. That horrible sense of being hated and guilty far from home. And nothing explained why that thing was 10 feet tall with inverted knees. As soon as the sun came up, I ran back to the blind and took it down. Then ran back to camp with my rifle and bag, packed everything up, and hiked out. I've never fired a gun in the woods since, and I don't ever intend to again. I'm not a spiritual person, but if that wasn't something in the forest telling me to leave it alone, I don't know what is. I can take a hint. I don't think I'll ever know exactly what that creature was, but I know what I saw. Next time you're up in the woods alone, be quiet, be respectful, and don't kill anything you don't have to. I thought at first Greg's story was too far-fetched to be true, but as he told it, I saw how truly scared he was. This confident, soft-spoken military man was shuddering through his story, hands shaking and face pale. I don't know what to make of it, but he said the area this occurred is one I'm quite familiar with, and it can be quite an eerie place. I have had a few experiences solo camping up there, but nothing on this scale. Sometimes being alone in the woods can feel like anything but. It just might be that there's some force out there, some inhuman creature that guards the woods. Just in case, I take extra care to be respectful whenever I'm among nature. You never know what could be watching. I had just gotten off Interstate 40 and was driving on US 191 north through the Navajo Res in Arizona one night heading to New Mexico. I'm looking for a gas station, not a car on the secluded highway. It being too dark and I somehow took a wrong turn onto a dirt road. It was because of my lack of sleep. The sign read, Ganado. Still driving, trying to make sense of my direction, I ended up at this garbage dump site. I was completely lost and saw nothing. Just pitch black darkness with the only light of the moon and some wisps of clouds covering the small part of it. Miles of bushes, some small trees, and a cornfield. The dump site was a large area. Piles of garbage were stacked. Debris scattered the road and bushes. Deciding that I needed to figure out where I was, I stopped my car and put it in park. My AC was on and the smell of decaying fish hit my nose like a baseball bat to the face. Gagging, I turned off the AC, ready to look at my phone for Google Maps. The smell was foul, but I needed to get on the right track. My headlights had illuminated the area so I could see most of the piles. Then I noticed something was moving just near the pile. There was a small coyote digging through the trash. I could see it clearly with my bright headlights. But the weird thing was, I realized it wasn't a small coyote. It looked like a small build figure of a kid. The kid stood up quickly, looking at me. I could clearly see his face and what he wore. Swearing out loud, I could see that he was covered in black paint with a fur pelt wrapped around him that looked like it had been recently skinned. I noticed that it was the pelt of a small coyote. For a few seconds, everything registered in my brain. There in front of me stood a little boy, about 12 years old, covered in black paint and wrapped in a small coyote pelt, digging through the trash looking for something. And now he had stopped what he was doing, standing there, looking at me. I let out a yelp and the boy looked to my left. And as my head turned, nearly causing myself whiplash, there stood another, much larger figure in the brush. There stood a tall, heavy-built man covered from head to toe in paint. The parent. Also wearing a larger thin pelt of a coyote. He stood there staring at me, his face covered in red and black face paint. Shoulder-length messy black hair hung limply down by his shoulders. He wore a huge quantity of turquoise necklaces, a silver concho belt around his waist, and silver bracelets that shined from both my headlights and the moon. It looked like it was teaching the little boy, his son, something at night. I could see his face from a distance. A stern, mean face. His eyes weren't normal. They were black, soulless, and beady looking. It was as if they were looking into my soul. Then he smiled from ear to ear. I saw his sharp teeth. What the hell? Again, I screamed bloody murder as he ran at my car. My foot above the gas, I made the decision not to try to run them over for fear of having my window busted and being dragged out into the bush. Screaming, my heartbeat hammering against my chest and trying not to have a heart attack, still gagging at the smell that worsened. I put the car in reverse, stepping on the gas, nearly running off the road as he ran towards me. As I was making a U-turn, I heard the sound of what I know were his nails scratching the back of my car. I put the car in drive, my throat hurt from screaming, but that was all I could do as I looked into my rearview mirrors to see him sprinting down the road catching up to me. 54 miles an hour on the dirt road, then onto the highway, another 70 to 80 miles per hour, hoping I wouldn't crash. Driving like a madman, fully awake, my thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what I saw. I made it back onto Interstate 40 and kept driving, too afraid to stop, making it to New Mexico in record time. I kept my story to myself because of the backlash my friends and family would probably give me. So, this is a true cautionary tale to those late-night travelers. You may or may not see anything during the dead hours on secluded reservation roads. Just be careful what roads you take. Never having lived by myself before, I was pretty scared about what to expect. I graduated college and had landed a pretty decent job with a generous starting salary. But the downside was that I had to move far away from where I was currently living with my parents. It's been about 3.5 weeks since I moved out and I've been getting along pretty well by myself. Even in college, I had a roommate and was only 30 minutes away from my parents' house. Now, I'm living alone 2 states away from my family, so I think that I took the sudden change pretty well. I don't know if it's because of the recent stress about moving and everything, but I've been having the same reoccurring nightmare for the past couple of weeks. I'll wake up in the middle of the night covered in sweat, heart pounding, not remembering why I'm so scared, only to have the details of my dream come flooding back to me. Most of the time, I don't even go back to sleep because I'm so scared that I'll dream it again. I don't want to tell my parents about this because they're stressed enough as it is, with me living alone and so far away for the first time in my life. But it's starting to eat me alive. I've gotten very little sleep and it's beginning to show at my new job. I would say that one of the creepiest parts of my recurring nightmare is that I keep having these out-of-body experiences while I'm dreaming. I don't know how common out-of-body experiences are, but I think that having one every night for 2 weeks in a row is pretty rare.